I know what it feels like to not really be able to take a holiday, where if you're not in your business, then everything is just going to fall apart. We want to grow and scale and we want to generate more revenue, but finding the right people is really difficult. But also when we do find those people, we have to kind of micromanage. And so the reason this happens is because So the first key principle that we need to understand, if you're going to take yourself out of the day-to-day and you're going to stop feeling stuck in your business, is that in order to grow and scale or kind of amplify our business, we have to first simplify it. Simplification is about creating one process or one way of doing things that everybody can follow. So the question then becomes, well, how do we have the right process? Like, what is the right process? We have to If you feel a little bit trapped in your business, then today's episode of the Creative Courage podcast is for you. I know what it feels like to not really be able to take a holiday. That feeling where if you're not in your business, then everything is just going to fall apart. It's almost like operational chaos, or just that if you leave your team or whoever you're working with to their own devices, then they're not going to get the creative output that you need them to. So today, I want to talk about how to take yourself out of the business so you can focus on the high leverage tasks. I guess more importantly, the creatively fulfilling tasks, sort of pick and choose what you want to work on. And so I'm going to talk about three big ideas, three key concepts that have really helped my clients to extract themselves from the business. In fact, last year when I was working with Eric, he actually took a whole month off and went to the Amazon and was basically out of contact with his team for, I think, a couple of weeks. And when he came back, everything was still running. I've got lots of case studies. I remember having a conversation with Pippa, who's a photographer, and we set up this system that was getting her to book appointments, and her VA was booking her sales calls. And so she went on holiday and came back, and she had a calendar full of sales calls. And so there's lots of different ways that we can do this. And obviously, if you've been listening to the podcast at all, you would have heard me speak to people like Grant and other people like Robin who talk about productizing the business. So there's kind of lots of different ways to do this. But today I want to focus on just three key principles that you really need to embody in your business if you're going to take yourself out of the day-to-day and you're going to stop feeling stuck in your business. So let's talk about, first of all, why this actually happens. Most creatives get good at a particular skill set, and that could be design, it could be animation, it could be filmmaking. And then they reach their capacity. They have lots of clients, or they win big projects and they feel like they need help. So they enroll or recruit other people to help them. So I'm going to take the example of videography because I've got a client that's kind of going through this process right now. He is pretty much at capacity, but he's also very tied to his business. And so we're having this discussion around how does he take himself out of his business? So the first thing he's looking at is, well, I'd really needed a good editor, because if I had a good editor, then that would free up a lot of my time. And so most people, this is kind of how they build their business. And so we get an editor, and then maybe we get like a camera operator, and then maybe we get like a project manager or somebody to kind of take care of the day-to-day running and the clients. And there's nothing innately wrong with this, but essentially what we're doing is we're kind of trying to duplicate various tasks. And what typically happens is that we find people who are good, but sometimes they just don't create the kind of output that we want them to create, or we don't feel like the work is at the same standard as it needs to be, or our standard, in order to impress the client or to keep the kind of standards that we're used to in our business. And so we go through this kind of whole battle of we want to grow and scale, and we want to take on more work, and we want to generate more revenue, but finding the right people is really difficult. But also when we do find those people, we tend to have to kind of micromanage or end up managing a team of people. And then we're doing things that we don't really want to be doing, or we're doing things that aren't really the reason we started the business in the first place. And so the reason this happens is because from the beginning, what we're really trying to do is sort of replicate ourselves or just take tasks off of our plate. And everything is very sort of customized. Nothing really has any predictability about it. Nothing has any kind of systemization about it. And so if we want to move away from that and create a plan, then we need to do these three key things. So the first kind of key concept or key principle that we need to understand is that in order to grow and scale or kind of amplify our business, we have to first simplify it. So the more complicated it is, like the more moving parts, the more kind of custom projects that we have, the harder it's going to be to grow in a way that doesn't just create more chaos and more stress in our lives. And so I've seen this a lot. Like I've worked with teams that have 6 to 10 people, and the founders are just totally stressed and they are earning less money than they did when it was just them. And the reason is because it's like total operational chaos. What they've tried to do is replicate themselves and replicate or take some of the tasks off of their plate that they were doing with other people doing that task. But everything is totally customized. So there's no real like process. So the first thing we have to do is we have to make everything as simple as possible. So simplification is actually about creating one process or one way of doing things that everybody can follow. So rather than having a totally customized way that you get client results that depends on you having the consultation with the client or figuring out the problem, we need to have a process that can be taught to people, that can be learned, and that can be replicated, which gets the client the outcome. So that's the first kind of big idea around simplification. If we're going to simplify, we have to have the right process. So the question then becomes, well, how do we have the right process? Like, what is the right process? So this is big idea number 2, which is that we have to reverse engineer the outcome that we're actually getting for the client. So if we stick with the video example and we take my client, he typically works with farmers and businesses within the agricultural space. And so just a kind of side note or caveat, it is really important that you are relatively niched, or at least you have a particular problem that you are solving for a broader range of clients. If you are trying to solve lots of different problems for lots of different people, then that also creates a layer of complexity in the business and makes it harder and harder to scale. So let's go back to my client. He works within the agricultural industry. And so the problem that he is solving is he's helping them to charge more money and become sort of premium brands in their space, or launch products in the premium space within the sort of agricultural brands. And so one of the things that I got him to do was really figure out, like, how does he get that result for his client? From when that client says, hey, I need help, all the way through to them getting that result. What are all of the steps in that process? And actually reverse engineer that outcome. Now, that might seem laborious, but you only have to do it once, because when you nail that process, you then have something that is unique to you. You then have a process that you can take every single client through, that you can teach to people, and more importantly, you can actually create documentation around so that you form intellectual property. That then becomes your unique method, your unique way of doing things. And if you think about some of the most famous brands or the famous things that we know, for example, something that just sprung to my mind was like Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of the Highly Effective Person, right? That book. Or even just if you think about like Apple as a brand, they have these products that they own the intellectual property to, and that's what makes it valuable, and that's what makes it scalable. You know, Steve Jobs isn't alive anymore, but we still have the Mac. That was his idea. It was kind of his brainchild, right? We still have the iPhone. We have these things that exist even though he doesn't exist anymore. And ultimately, that's kind of what we're trying to do with your business. Even if you have no plans to sell it, or you're not actually trying to take yourself out of it permanently. We want to try and productize and simplify the way that we get results for our clients. Now, I'm going to address some concerns with this in a minute, because I know some of you are probably thinking, well, it sounds a bit boring. It sounds like it's stripping away the creativity, all of this kind of thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. But before I do, let's just quickly recap. So big idea number one is that you have to simplify your business. The more custom, the more bespoke, the more complicated it is, the harder it is going to be to scale. The second idea, and the way that we do that, is we reverse engineer the outcome so that we can nail that process down. Like, what is the process of getting our clients from A to B? Then the final idea is that we need to document that process, and we need to create what are often referred to as SOPs, standard operating procedures, right? How do we actually do that? So I want you to think of yourself almost like you're building a car, or you're building some kind of product that you have to ship. How do we make sure that this thing goes out of our door in a way that is fault-free and that people can drive, and it's going to get them from A to B, and it's not going to break down in between? And so if we can start thinking about our business more like this, it creates so much more freedom and allows us to actually be more creative, because all of the really logistical things, all of the complexity is stripped away, and it actually allows us to be more creative because we have that space and we have that freedom. We're not tied into our business. We're not tied into the day-to-day operations. So it could be as simple, if we go back to the example of the videography business, one of the things that my client said to me was, I've used editors in the past, and they're either really expensive if they can kind of get the same feel that I can, or that they just can't, like they just can't get the same creative output. And I said, but what process are you going through? Like, really down to the detail. How do you color grade that edit? Are there LUTs or whatever that you can save so that rather than this person having to kind of have their own style, they have your preset? Like, all of our films in this particular niche, if we're trying to create market differentiation, use these presets, for example, right? What is the actual process? How do you know when to cut from one scene to the other? So again, I know this can kind of sound quite granular, but once you've got it down, once you understand how to create your style or your output, then life just becomes so much easier because you have a process that you can replicate, that you can teach to people. And so going back to the car analogy, I know I've used lots of metaphors and things, but stick with the car analogy. It's a little bit like driving a manual car, right? It's like if you've ever driven a manual car, when you first start your driving test, I remember that feeling of just feeling totally overwhelmed. Like, I've got to balance this clutch with this accelerator and bring it up at the right time, whilst also then kind of like moving out of second gear when I start to get enough speed. But I can't forget to check my mirrors, because if I do that, there might be somebody there, and I've also got to turn the steering wheel, and like, there's all these different things happening. But then once you learn how to do it, it just becomes second nature. And if somebody asks you, how are you driving right now? That's quite a difficult question to answer, right? You're like, well, I'm just driving. Well, how do you know when to indicate and change lanes? And like, is there anything you're doing? And, you just do all of these things automatically without even thinking about it. So creativity is kind of the same. We're getting this result, but once we were a beginner and once we were learning how to get these results, we've just kind of forgot how we learned to do that. And so what we've got to do is almost like unlearn or relearn the process so that somebody else can follow along with it. And that becomes our process, our SOP. Like, how do we create edits for this kind of client? How are we actually getting the result for this kind of client? What are the steps? What things do we need to follow? And basically the idea is that we just kind of keep going through this, and we give it to someone and we see where they fall down. Like, they're just not getting this thing. They're just not creating the output. Well, what is it? Like, let's sit with them. Can they look over our shoulder? Can they shadow us, right? I remember listening to a video that Alex Hormozy put out a while ago, and he said how he uses other agencies. So if he was learning, if he wanted like an agency to run ads, for example, he would ask an amazing agency that got really good results consistently to run ads. Part of the deal would be he wants to shadow them, and he wants to understand exactly how they're creating that result so that eventually he can take it in-house and they become redundant. And he's very like transparent about that from the beginning. But what I love about that is he's basically taking their process and he's creating his own SOPs for his own business. And he's taking those methodologies and those frameworks and he's applying it to his own business and then saying, hey, team, this is how we create amazing ads. And he now has an internal asset where once he's done that and learned it for himself, he can then teach other people, and then he can totally take himself out of that process. So hopefully this makes sense. But like, I see a lot of people in basically operational chaos, see a lot of people stuck in their business, even if they're at like multiple 5 figures a month. If they take a holiday, the whole business stops. And it's simply because A, it's too complex. B, they don't have a process that they take every single client through. And C, they don't have that process documented, and they don't have processes and systems in their business documented so that somebody else can get that result without them. So if you found these helpful and insightful, maybe you know this stuff already, but you're just not doing it in your business. And that's a key distinction. Sometimes I remember I used to run webinars and workshops, and people would come up to me at the end and say like, oh, that was really interesting. I kind of know these things already, but I've never heard someone explain it in this way. Or I kind of know this, but I'm not really doing it. It's like, great. Well, knowledge without implementation is pretty useless from a business perspective, right? So maybe this is just your kick up the ass to actually go and do these things, right? Actually go and document it. I am releasing a brand new book in September, which has a section about how to take yourself out of the business, all around client delivery. So keep an eye out for that. I will be talking about it more and more on this podcast. I do also have some YouTube videos around some of these ideas as well. But don't overcomplicate this. It really isn't more complicated than the 3 things that I spoke about. So first of all, look for where is the complexity in your business right now? Like, does every single project that you bring on have a totally new process or a totally new way of working? Do you have a process? Do you have something that you take every single client through? How much of that is documented? Like, what areas of your business fail first when you take yourself away? What things fall down first? Is it that your team don't deliver on the project? Is it that you don't get enough sales? Like, what's going on for you? And just kind of spend a bit of time really looking at, where is my business a bit too complex? Where don't we have really solid processes in place? Where don't we have really solid documentation and SOPs to guide people to create these specific results? As always, if you found this podcast valuable, there's actually just one thing that I would like you to do. If you listen to this on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, I think it is now called. If you could go on to Apple Podcasts and just leave a review. So search for Creative Courage, and then at the side, there should be something that says review. It just really helps other people to know what this podcast is about and what you got from it. So if you found this or any of the podcast episodes valuable, then please just take 2 seconds, search for Apple Podcasts, click on Apple Podcasts, search for Creative Courage, and just leave a review. And that would really mean a lot to me. Thanks for listening. This is the Creative Courage Podcast. My name is Matt Essam, and I will see you next week.